A static choke transmission crackled over command lines. "This is the human warship Redemption, or not." And then silence. Shock roiled through every listening post. An enemy armada encircled humanity's last line of defense, and the faint final broadcast was the sound of a last, desperate stand. From the furthest outposts on the fringe of the Milky Way to the central planets where the legacy of humanity had once thrived, a simple truth rang across every station and colony: that the war was all but lost. Humanity had fought bravely for decades against an unforgiving coalition of alien species whose technology surpassed anything Terran engineers could cobble together. And even with the valiant efforts of Earth and her allies, defeat was inevitable. Political fractures back on Earth had eroded once strong joint will, and despite previous alliances with neighboring species, had buckled under the pressure of the enemy that faced the fleet, the Reevelin Axis. Of all the vessels still surviving from humanity's once magnificent stellar navy, the battleship Redemption was the last genuine warship that could realistically oppose the Axis on any meaningful scale. The Redemption's hull had endured antimatter salvos, superheated plasma barges, and kinetic weaponry that punctured lesser ships like paper on countless occasions. Where entire fleets had fallen, Redemption remained. It danced among the flaming corpses of Terran cruisers and battered frigates, returning bloodied but undefeated. The stories of its resilience traveled fast, and it became the standard-bearers for a species on the brink of extinction. With unshakable stubbornness, Captain Akari Hawthorne led inside the Redemption. She had only taken on the post half a year ago, after her predecessor fell to devastating wounds in the nightmarish rout that was the Euraxis Belt. The crew cut that covered Captain Hawthorne's head, streaked with signs of premature aging, spoke to the terrible burden she had been under. But her stature was still confident, her eyes worn by every daunting experience. She had a unique gift for noticing the potential in each member of her crew, creating a bond that no challenge seemed too great to overcome. Under her leadership, a ragtag all-male group of veteran and rookie soldiers metamorphosed from a drifting wing and a prayer band of survivors into a family that fought together against impossible odds. Her officers included Commander Talkova, the buttoned-up first officer who once served on Earth's diplomatic flagship, before it had been ruined. Tal knew how to dissect strategies from both humans and aliens, and to expand upon that knowledge from the numerous transmissions that had been intercepted and from battlefield data logs. And there was Lieutenant Jace Murdoch, the ship's weapons officer, who channeled his personal heartbreak, losing his family in an Axis raid, into a furious determination to master every ballistic, laser, and gravitic weapon within reach. Chief Engineer Sadia Varma kept the Redemption limping along on borrowed time, patching hull breaches, cajoling more thrust from much-damaged engines, rerouting power through ancient circuits. Without her tireless work, the warship would have simply drifted into forgotten history long ago. The galaxy itself had become a patchwork of contested territories. Humanity's former frontier worlds were now pockmarked by orbital bombardments, forcibly evacuated, or utterly lost to enemy dominion. Refugees swarmed the final safe stations on Earth, hoping that the rampaging Axis could be stymied. With the Terran fleet all but destroyed, the last glimmer of hope depended on the Redemption. The retreating evacuation convoys were given some time, but normally no other ship was left to do so. And so, the cry went up for the Redemption to take a stand. High Command was dislocated into secret bunkers on Luna and Mars, reduced to desperate communications as the surface of the Earth prepared for the worst. From these bunkers came orders for Captain Hawthorne: hold the Magellan Corridor at any cost. It was the sole path taking one directly from the heart of the Axis into Earth. If they got through there, the Axis would be in Earth's orbit in weeks or even days. However, give the order, every rational mind knows suicide or not, but not a voice of dissent could be heard aboard the Redemption's bridge. Every officer knew what their responsibility was. If they could hold up the enemy just long enough, every colony transport and refugee ship could slip into warp, escaping to uncharted deep space. Lives would be saved. The dream of re-establishing humankind elsewhere, of courting friendly species and, one day, maybe returning, rested on the Redemption's last stand. They were not merely defending an outpost. They were defending the principle that humanity would never submit to cruelty or oblivion. As the warship reached the Magellan Corridor, a treacherous stretch of space filled with gravitational anomalies, sensor operators gasped as countless enemy signatures winked into view. The Re-Evelyn Axis had gathered a titanic armada, warships of a larger class than anything that had been seen before, carriers overflowing with strike craft, and a swarm of agile destroyers ready to close the noose and cut off any escape. The numerical difference was staggering. Despite the formidable rail cannons, shock lance turrets, and guided torpedoes armed with experimental warheads, it was one castle. Axis admirals called over open comm channels for surrender, unconditioned. Each phone call concluded with the same ultimatum: submit or be cleansed from the galaxy. Captain Hawthorne's answer was definitive. She broadcast a defiant message across all frequencies, her voice steady with a calm intensity that concealed her own dread of mortality. We will never submit. If these are to be the last hours of our lives, let history note, we did not kneel. We stand. With that pronouncement, the Redemption took its place within the narrow approach of the Magellan Corridor and braced for the fury to follow. Gloom deepened in the corridors. Younger hands whispered to ancient deities of Earth. Veterans merely checked their gear. Engineering crews raced against the clock to stabilize the reactor for sustained, maximum output, and the weapons decks rattled as final calibrations were made. The whole warship throbbed with tension, gearing up for the inevitable storm. The final transmissions from Earth still echoed in the back of everyone's mind. This was it. No reinforcements would arrive, no last-minute miracle. The Redemption was the sole guardian, a thin thread of hope for man stretched taut across the pulsing universe. And then there was just fighting left. The initial cast from the Re-Evelyn Axis was a curtain of energy pips flying through the void, glowing with deadly purpose. Lieutenant Murdoch coordinated the Redemption's counterfire in response. There were rail cannons that thundered as they launched their hyper-accelerated slugs that punched through enemy shielding. The whole ship shook from the recoil, and, amidst vibrating chaos, Captain Hawthorne's voice cut through. Keep formation. Protect the engines. Fire everything we've got. It didn't take long for the Axis ships to discover their apparent easy prey was no ordinary target. The Redemption twisted with surprising grace for a behemoth, writhing in the gravitational eddies of the corridor. Plasma torpedoes that should have turned its armor into vapor mist by centimeters, diverted by last-moment thruster burns. Each time a destructive beam hit them directly, Chief Engineer Varma was able to reroute power from non-essential systems, keeping life support and their weapons up and running at the cost of lighting, temperature control, and other creature comforts. The crew was awash in flickering emergency lights, but they forged ahead, undeterred. Wave after wave of Axis cruisers and destroyers swept in phalanx, each flank belching forth thousands of fighter drones. The Redemption's point defense lasers etched bright lines across the darkness, exploding uncounted drones in mid-flight, long before the swarm ever came close to the warship's perimeter. Still, it was not enough. In the end, one warship alone could not hold back the unstoppable mass of the Axis. A swarm of bombers broke from the main formation, rolling into an intricate attack pattern. They loosed a class of warheads that cascaded thundering against the Redemption's starboard side. In one area, deck plating tore open, creating gaps that exposed compartments to the vacuum of space. Alarms blared, and medical crews rushed into action, closing bulkheads to limit further decompression. Commander Kova organized the damage reports. The stoic first officer methodically directed resources to important points, transmitting extensive repair crews to patch leaking conduits and seal hull breaches. Kova's measured voice delivered updates over internal channels. Section D-12 has been destroyed, Captain. Few casualties, but we have lost an auxiliary reactor. Captain Hawthorne nodded curtly, unwilling to betray despair. Focus on the survivors. Divert energy from off-the-grid backups. We'll make do. Yet even in the damaged state of the hull, the Redemption made the enemy pay for every inch of ground. Maneuvering thrusters rocked the ship around asteroids that peppered the corridor, using them as ad hoc cover. The primary rail cannons opened punishing fire, ripping holes through Axis destroyers. When the scorched hull of an Axis ship drifted, Redemption hammered it viciously and created an internal cascade that left the enemy craft's remains tumbling into the infinite void. But new waves kept surging in, adjusting maneuvers to pin the human ship from several directions. Through comms, an alien voice hissed, "Surrender, Earthlings. Your defiance is pointless." But those calls went unheeded. With every passing minute, the tension on the Redemption's bridge grew. Not even the supportive bends of the corridor's cyclonic cosmic anomalies could compensate for the basic magnitude of the Axis attack. The pressure was felt across the crew. They were playing a deadly game of cat and mouse, delaying an enemy that outmatched them in every quantifiable way. Their courage and craft saw them through the battle's opening hours. However, energy supplies were running low. The reactor stabilizers were being driven to dangerous extremes. Chief Engineer Varma reported. Any more push could overload its quantum matrix. The forward rail cannons were starting to misalign from repeated recoil shocks. A corridor after corridor on the warship was clogged with emergency teams taking care of the wounded or putting duct tape on overheated conduits. Through it all, Captain Hawthorne held her ground. She was aware that fear was eating away at her crew, particularly the junior ensigns. Even still, she offered words of encouragement where appropriate, reminding them that every second they held was an invaluable gift of time to the retreating transports behind them. Stories would be told of their bravery, she said. The galaxy would not forget the stand they took. In quiet corners of the warship, some officers clutched one another's hands, sharing secrets, strengthening bonds. They reveled in the fact that every minute that they lived was due to their teamwork and expertise. In the meantime, Axis strategists realized that a direct, brute force assault was costing them ships they could not part with. The Sea Raiders soon started to break apart, leaving the ships to mill about, casting low-powered scans near the signal of the signal buoy. They tried encasing the Redemption in a bubble of unbreakable force, blocking every exit. Captain Hawthorne knew the signs. The Reevelan admirals were finished underestimating them. The next surge would be perfectly choreographed, striking the warship from multiple angles all at once. Commander Kova's brow furrowed as the sensors confirmed the worst, an ominous cluster of battleships forming a pincer. "Captain, they're starting with an encirclement strategy. Let me know when the estimated time contact in 5 minutes." Hawthorne took a sharp breath, glancing at the readouts flashing across her command console. Lieutenant Murdoch, charge the last torpedo banks. We'll blow them in a chain reaction to scatter their formation. Murdoch nodded, his voice a little quaky with a strange combination of rage and thrill. "Aye, Captain. We'll send them a surprise." The scheme was simple but fraught with danger. Fire off the remaining torpedoes in timed volleys, forcing the Axis capital ships to turn away and away from each other, breaking their encirclement. The downside was that it would leave the Redemption with no heavy munitions left in the tubes once those torpedoes were expended. Yet there was no alternative. Humanity's battered war vessel needed to take every advantage, however narrow. As the enemy formation came into its final approach, the Redemption unleashed volley after volley of torpedoes, each armed with experimental shockwave generators. Bathing the corridor in dazzling eruptions, shockwaves that convulsed space-time in localized bursts. Dozens of Axis vessels were disintegrated by snap, gravitic lacerations. Others had to go wide, breaking up their tight formation. For a brief, glorious period, the Axis lines were confused, giving the Redemption a precious opportunity to slide farther into the corridor's chaos of maelstrom. Bloodied but not beaten, the Axis struck back. A storm of energy beams lit up this star-specked darkness, ravaging the Redemption's rear end. The hull plating on the port side peeled away like foil under a blowtorch. Flames licked whole compartments, and then those compartments ruptured, venting atmosphere and blowing debris outward. Many crew members died in those explosive decompressions. In the bay's main hangar, Lieutenant Murdoch as weapons teams watched in horror as vast sections of the ship went dark on internal sensors. It felt like an eternity every second. With each name, Captain Hawthorne's heart thudded painfully in his chest, a number representing the cost of their mortality and defiance against the Empyrean. She ordered her few available fighter squadrons, refurbished interceptors older than most of her ensigns, to launch from the battered hangar. Their mission: safeguard the warship's flanks until the final pass. Those tiny vessels leapt into hyperspace, hurtling towards the incoming fleet of bombers, valiantly trying to intercept, only to plummet into brilliant plumes of light as clouds of alien fighters outnumbered them. Bloodied but unbowed, the Redemption moved forward. Her beaten frame sliced through the flecked abyss, a last stand of a night guard unwilling to bend. Inside the hallways, medics scrambled, triaging the injured. Salvage plates and makeshift force fields sealed hull breaches. There was little time left, but as long as their battered warship was still above water, it was a testament to the unyielding determination of its crew. Back in the command center, the atmosphere was thick with adrenaline and dread. Captain Hawthorne tried to steady her shaking hands as she scanned for the next wave to appear on sensors. The Axis were regrouping, moving in a desperate way around the whirling distortions in the fabric of gravity that had slowed them down in the first place. They were done playing games. It was a waste of energy, however, as the Reevelyn Armada had descended with relentless speed this time, anticipating the final blow. But even in those final throes of the conflict, something remarkable flowered among the crew. A sentient synergy of purpose coursed through the warship. Junior officers eagerly volunteered for the riskiest repair missions. Comrades offered brief, emotional farewells. The consciousness of their imminent death was like every passing second an act of human defiance, one close to a declaration of veneration, hope, love, duty. These were not just words, but living forces that united them, creating a grim bulwark against despair. They had given Earth precious time. They would not falter now. On the Redemption's bridge, red hazard lights lit up tired faces. The next line of Axis battleships, having become a tightly sealed wedge, now pushed forward with methodical precision. They loomed terrifyingly in unison, their silhouettes traced with lines of pulsing lights that spelled unstoppable, advanced weaponry. Listless skirmishers drifted and drifted between them as fighter wings orbited them like a swarm of hornets, slipping sugars and nectar before the hornets delivered the killing blow. At the center of the command deck stood Captain Hawthorne, her uniform tattered and smeared with dried blood from an earlier explosion that had rocked the bridge. Even so, her eyes gleamed with a fierce determination that seemed to skip over any bit of defeat. "We knew what we were signing up for," she said, her voice steady as she looked around at her officers. "Every second we hold them here saves innumerable lives behind us. Let's make it count." Silence descended, an acceptance of fate. Then the Axis wedge opened fire, unleashing a storm of plasma beams. The warship came apart under the barrage and entire sections faded on the schematic overhead. Damaged klaxons screamed, but the Redemption replied with her last rail cannon barrage, two massive slugs that bludgeoned into the first Axis cruiser. A wide hole opened in the alien battleship's hull, venting its atmosphere and washing internal debris out into the void. The Axis column staggered, briefly dawdled by the violent attrition of their rear guard. Deep in the belly of the Redemption, Chief Engineer Varma was hunched over a console. Smoke wafted off sparking circuits as she cleaned and rerouted power to keep the weapons and thrusters going. The reactor convulsed ominously, on the verge of meltdown if it was pushed any further. She spoke to the captain over a crackling comm line. "Captain, the reactor cannot withstand another protracted surge. We can muster enough energy for one more high-threat attack, and then it breaks containment." Her voice cracked slightly, but her determination was apparent. Sacrifice had become unavoidable. Hawthorne took in the engineer's words. The tightness in her chest grew stronger. She knew what followed, that there would be no opportunity to survive if the reactor lost containment. Maybe it was the plan all along, always the last inevitability. She remembered Earth, her home, and everyone who was depending on her, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second. Then she opened them, clarity flickering in her gaze. "Varma, rig it. When I say the word, throw every bit of energy we have into the primary guns. No half measures." Commander Kova realized immediately that this was the final decision. The whole plan relied on one last, cataclysmic blow that could shatter the Axis advance, or at least provide minutes or hours of time for the evacuees. "Captain," he said in a low voice, "I'm with you." It was not just an officer's duty, but a sign of solidarity, proof of the loyalty she had inspired. Word rippled around the ship that the final order had arrived. Injured soldiers leaned on each other, helping medics attempt to evacuate, But in reality, there was nowhere truly safe. Weapon teams made ready near red-hot turrets, braced to pour every shot they possessed into the unstoppable surge. Engineers battled on deep in the engine bay, frantically reconfiguring couplings and stabilizers. If a meltdown was inevitable, at least they would direct that explosive power at the enemy. Outside, the Axis warships were ever bigger, the void between them and the Redemption alive with lethal potential. The human vessel drifted slightly, her thrusters spent, her armor scored. But the Axis admirals did sense that something was wrong. They picked up a spike of energy forming in the reactor core of the Redemption. It was not from normal weapons fire. It was something much more desperate. The Axis dreadnoughts, finally realizing what the humans were planning, moved to alter their formation, spreading out to minimize risk. If the humans had deliberately sought a self-destruction, then the Reevelan admirals would prefer to take minimal losses. As they maneuvered, however, the gravitational anomalies within the corridor constrained how much they could back away. The Redemption had picked the battleground with care. On the bridge, Captain Hawthorne held fast to the edge of her command console. Cables hung loosely from the ceiling, swaying in the residual gravity fields. Smoke and embers darkened the sky. Her voice sounded through the ship-wide speakers. "This is the captain. Crew of the Redemption. I am proud of each and every one of you. We fought valiantly, and we did our duty. Soon I will end the third blow. For those that can reach escape pods, now would be the time to do so. For the rest, stay strong. Earth is watching, and history will remember our stand." Tears formed in the eyes of veterans who had served a dozen battles. Younger ensigns traded stuttering nods of reassurance. Some had time to strap into crash webbing. Others just shut their eyes and thought of home. A handful of committed crews stayed at crucial stations, ignoring the siren call of escape pods for the chance of inflicting maximum damage when the time came. At engineering, Varma made the final touches, sweat and grime smeared over her face. The reactor's quantum matrix wailed with overpressure warnings. Adrenaline pumping, she went to the bridge. "Captain, we're ready. All safety locks are off. Just give the command." A few seconds felt like forever. Comms dark on Saturday and before. After 4 days of battle, Commander Kova could see the Axis wedge advancing once more and preparing a knockout blow. The corridor sparkled and crackled with energy discharges. Then Captain Hawthorne issued the last command. "All batteries, open fire." Every weapon capable of firing did in blinding streams of rail slugs, plasma, and focused energy beams that lashed out from the warship like a striking god of lighting. As the Axis ships struggled to return fire, the sky was filled with deadly pyrotechnics. The reactor quickly overloaded due to the power surge, and the meltdown sequence began. The Redemption detonated, an enormous, brilliant torrent of energy spearing out from it in a wave of destruction. For a moment, it was as though a tiny star had flared in the corridor. The shockwave battered the Axis warships, shredding shields, deforming hulls, and scattering entire formations. Smaller vessels crumbled on contact, and even the largest dreadnoughts staggered as the devastating strike hit them. Screams and foreign tongues reverberated in the Axis communications in a frenzy of directives to fall back immediately. In that cataclysmic maelstrom, the Redemption herself was engulfed. Hull plates flaked off in the relentless chain reaction fueling its core. Fire ran through every deck, lighting oxygen lines and shorting out every circuit in one last, glorious pyre. The howls of rending metal reverberated through the bones of the ship as vast tracts of it folded inward, becoming a maelstrom of contorted wreckage. The warship then exploded in a final rush of resistance, scattering brilliant debris along the corridor. The Redemption was no more at that moment, but its defiance etched itself into the memory of the universe with an indelible last stand. For many witnesses of the event, it was as if the spirit of that warship had temporarily overshadowed the starlight. The titanic scale of devastation rippled across the area, resulting in a tempestuous debris field and bruised Axis craft. Then, as the dust cleared, the calendar survivors of the Reevelan fleet saw that the road ahead to Earth was not so easy. It would take countless hours, perhaps even days, to regroup, make repairs, and quell the growing dread that had seeped into the hearts of their ranks. They had not anticipated humans fighting so ruthlessly and tenaciously. It was a victory, but one paid for dearly, shaking the confidence of their erstwhile invincible fleet. Back at Earth's secret bunkers, the final broadcast from the Redemption went dead abruptly. Technicians and officers gazed in the silence in stunned reverence. They knew what it meant. Tears streamed down faces. Some kind of birdsong began to echo on the refugee fleets. That last, glorious stand had ended in flames. There would be no rescue, no happy reunion. But the time that the Redemption had purchased was priceless in its significance. Enough time for some to escape, to cultivate new alliances, to consolidate power. Sufficient for humanity, roughened but not shattered, to survive a little longer. And thus the story death knell into silence, not deafening on surrender, but ever unyielding like a roar to the cosmos. With half-closed eyes, the debris-encrusted halls of the Magellan Corridor told a tale of hope and despair. Possibly, the Redemption was dead, but its sacrifice had sent shockwaves through the whole galaxy. And the tale swept through human refugees and sympathetic alien enclaves alike. Single, plucky warship versus entire armada. And it had fought them just long enough for thousands of transports to scatter to unknown frontiers. From secret bunkers on Luna to far-off orbital stations in the Kuiper Belt, the impact was deep. Families that had once given up hope on ever seeing their loved ones were reinvigorated by the Redemption's last act. Kids who'd never known Earth's golden age listened in wide-eyed wonder as veterans recounted the warship's defiance. Redemption remains a name, a symbol, a reminder that humanity fights tooth and nail against all odds. In secret meetings, rebel leaders, scientists, and diplomats started to plan a new path toward humanity's survival, emboldened by the knowledge that the Axis could be defeated. A handful of crew members escaped in life pods, catapulted away from the warship in the final moments before the meltdown. Their pods floated among the destruction, obscured in the drifting flotsam, before eventually picked up by sympathizing cargo freighters or rescue ships that trailed in the wake of the corridor. They bore the final logs of Captain Hawthorne and the memory of what it had meant to serve on the legendary warship's last stand. In every survivor's eyes burned a fierce, unspoken determination to take the legacy of their dead comrades forward. The Re-Evelyn Axis, for its part, struggled with the losses it faced. Their admirals fumed, offended and amazed, forced to admit that an inferior species had delivered such a crushing blow. Taking advantage, Earth's defenders scrambled to fortify defenses at the solar gates while the aliens regrouped. Civilians who had been unable but resigned to their fate had now summoned any might left in them to reinforce bunkers, work on weapon prototypes never before conceived, or make telepathic calls across the numberless and barren star systems for new allies. Even so, the future was still perilous, and the Axis had been impeded, not routed. Inspiring, the memory of the Redemption's sacrifice was not, however, enough to defeat an entire coalition. The future will depend on cunning, alliances, the intangible power of unity to face the next assault. Yet the memory of that last stand burned bright, a beacon in the dark void. Thus it was that the Redemption would be lost with all hands and find its final resting place among the swirling cosmic wreckage of the Magellan Corridor, if only a more or less suitable epitaph of the indomitable spirit of man. Even as it was no more, its final moments would reverberate across the stars for generations. The human ship was only one ship, but it did so much damage, so whispers spread in corridors of power far away from Earth. What if the human species rose up again in new defiance? The answers lay in a future as uncertain as the cosmic tides. But one thing was certain: humanity had not given in. The memory of the Redemption, its grit, bravery, and ultimate sacrifice, endured, stoking the fires of resistance. Across scattered human colonies and hidden enclaves, that spirit was reborn, the defiant roar of the warship's last stand never to die. It would echo in the hearts of every soul who dared dream of a galaxy without tyranny, igniting the hope that one day mankind would return in glory and forge peace, reclaiming all that was lost. Although even the Axis, behind the closed doors of their strategy halls, could sense the resounding tremors. Their dreams of an easy victory had turned to ash as they realized the terrible truth: mankind would always resist, regardless of the cost. The full might and pomp of the Reevelyn Empire could not smother the faint echoes of Captain Hawthorne's dying words. Humanity does not kneel. And ultimately, the cosmos remained immense and indifferent, full of infinite marvels and terrors. And yet, in that vacuum, a single warship's final stand sandbagged like legend, a clarion call that would soon see the free peoples of the galaxy band together against tyranny. And in so doing, the last act of the Redemption and her crew were a fitting testimony, as both of them would live forever in the annals of history as the heroes who chose defiance over despair. Their legacy stretched far beyond the veil of their own termination, an eternal vow that the human spirit would never die.